Can you see the annotations as well if I start drawing? Just because it might make it easier. You see that?
Yeah.
Yeah. Great. All right. I'm gonna hide you out the way there. I'm still on the annotate. There we go. Sweet. All right. So this is just going to go through like a few tips and tricks with form state and custom validators. I know it's an area that we kind of dabble in a lot of our apps. And there's a few mistakes that I used to make a lot that I've kind of learned from. So I'm going to try and just sort of pass that knowledge on. Maybe other people will find it useful as well. I'm going to go right from the top. So it's probably going to start off pretty slow. I know people are familiar with like the basic form stuff already, so I'll try and skim through that as much as possible. Because this is kind of aimed at sort of junior to intermediate Angular devs. So if you're kind of advanced, then sorry for putting you to sleep, but we'll see. So yeah, straight up from the top, I'm going to build on this. So step one, I've just built a little basic form here. You've seen this a million times. It's just using the form builder stuff. Creating 3 controls, and we're hooking it up to a couple of input fields. Array syntax with the form builder stuff. For those who don't use the form builder syntax, just an array. First value is the default value, and then the second value is an array of validators. You'll see that build up as we go through. So first step, I'm going to add a bit of validation here. So all I'm saying here is I've got a little validators.required on the city, and that's just saying the city must be populated. Again, you've probably seen this a million times. We are building up, we promise. One thing to note here quickly, just to highlight, if I can bring my little thingy up. You've probably seen this before as well, but I've got the, I'm hooking into the errors object here for the city, because as we've now got required, whenever those validators fail, they would add to the error object, and we can then access that error object to kind of feedback those validation issues back to the users ASAP. Again, you've probably seen this before as well. We're hooking into the actual form state just to disable the form if it's not valid. So we're going to look at this like it was a massive form. So let's say, for example, we want to split our form into several components. So there's probably a lot of reasons for this. You could have shared components of common form sections. You could have big old wizards, or you could just have some parts of your form that's got a lot of complex logic or displaying some fancy display stuff going on. You want to shift that to its own component. So all I've done here to start with is I've kind of treated the address, so the city part of our previous form, as kind of like an address field, and we've pretended we've got like a little address form. So I might clear those old thingies. So you can see here, I can bring the drawing up. We've just got a little sort of address form component, and all we've done is we've called it here. And then we've also seen here, you've probably seen this area a million times as well. Form control name must be used with the parent form group directive. So that's because this component here, we've got a form control here, but the actual component itself doesn't have a form group directive in it anywhere. And it expects it, so it's like, what the hell are you doing? I need something passing in. So we can solve that in a neat little way. If I go back to the mouse, it's really obnoxious. So this might be something you've not seen before. This is a handy little trick that I learned at NG conference, I think it was. It's called the control container. So the general approach we usually take is we pass the parent form group instance here. So we'd pass it into the form component. We'd pass this form group in here, and then we'd wrap this in a form group directive as well. But what we can do is we can actually inject the parent form group in programmatically using this control container. So all we do is we pass it into the view providers, and this is telling Angular, if you're looking for a form group in this component, then use the existing one provided by the nearest parent. If it already exists, we aren't going to provide it anew. because you can just use the one from my parent component or the closest parent. So the result of this is our form group from the previous form, this one, will be passed into, the context will be passed into this component here, and it's not going to complain anymore because it now knows where its parent form group is. The problem with this, however, is you've probably noticed I've taken that mat error out to display, you know, if the required error. And that's because this component here obviously doesn't have access to the actual form group itself. So we can't access the error object and we can't display it. Again, there's a solution to this, but this little one-liner. This is really good if you want to kind of just split your form groups out into smaller components, and you don't really need to access the form group object itself. You just want to kind of just have a little dummy display form. But what if we want that form group itself and we want to access it and kind of get the state, get the validation on it? So we can get around this as well. So we've already provided the control container and the view providers. So all we need to do is actually access that. And to do that, we just inject it in the constructor. And then we can now access this with the control container.control. And that property there will give you your parent form group from the existing form group directive. And then you can kind of just do whatever you want with it. You know, you can access the errors again. As you can see, the mat error is back, and we can access the error object. So what if we want to treat that error, sorry, the address, as kind of its own form group? You've probably done this before yourself, where the address itself is its own form group object. So we've done that here, as you can see. But the problem here now is when we access that parent form group, it's going to say form controls city errors. So it's expecting that city control to be flat on the form group. And that's no longer true because we've nested it inside that address object. So what should we do here? So this is kind of just a little neat trick. The address form only really cares about the address form group, right? So we want to pass in the address form group into that child component, not the overall form group with the first name and the last name and all that stuff. So if we recall that the child component is going to say, give me the nearest form group directive, then all we've got to do is make that address form the nearest form group directive. So the easiest way we can do that is we literally use another form group directive, if that makes sense. I know that sounds really confusing. So all we've done there is we've used the bog standard Angular form group directive and said basically, this is your context now. There's no form group input in this address form. We're just using the default Angular one. So when that child component goes to say, what's my nearest form group directive, it's going to go up to the parent and it's going to see this address form. So we've kind of split that address part of the form into its own component, and we've given it the right context as well. I know that was kind of hard to follow. I know I suck at explaining this sort of stuff, but when it comes to composing like larger forms, and when we're splitting them into smaller form components, giving each component like its own context, its own part of the form, and its own component, it really helps kind of split it up. And it also makes those smaller components, you know, reusable in other parts of your app as well. That part wasn't vital. It's just a little kind of handy thing that I found to use just to sort of split your context up. Okay, so yeah.
Just to go back on that, Sam.
Yeah.
So where you've got that separate component for address form, so why not use a nested form group on parent and just pass in form group name as an input to that component?
You could. That's another solution to it. I find that it's less to manage because your child component requires less function. Because it's basically writing child components with the assumption that everything will be passed into it. So you can write your children like, all right, I'm going to be passed a form group, and I'm just going to write my component knowing that I've got a correct form group passed in. and we shift the responsibility of setting the context itself onto the parent. I find it preferential to do it this way. There's nothing wrong with doing it your way as well and just passing the form group in itself. Yeah, it is.
I'm not saying which way is best or if there's any advantages to either way. It's probably something I need to read up more on myself, but yeah, it's good to know that there is actually two ways of handling this.
Yeah, there's plenty of ways. Yeah, I prefer it this way because I like I kind of split all my forms into smaller components, and then I kind of compose it with a parent, and it's just that parent's job to kind of pass each part into the right place, and then obviously you can write the children without having to worry about fetching the right part of the form and all that stuff. Cool. Okay, so every single level of the form, so the controls themselves, the groups, is an abstract control, is the interface. And every single level has errors, it's got validation, it's got validity, it's got touched, pristine, all that stuff. So these properties will include themselves if it's a control. So, you know, valid on a form control will tell you if the form control is valid, obviously. But if you're on a group, that contains the validity of all its children as well. So it's kind of recursive for the children. So what does this mean exactly? So again, a control is valid if it's got no errors, or a form array is only valid if every single item in the array is valid. A form group's only valid if every other control under it is valid, and this includes nested form groups as well. So based on this, you can kind of get an idea of how you can compose your form as an object, and that gives you a lot of power over knowing if and when smaller parts of your form have had something happen to them, such as the validity changed, or if they've been touched, and you can react accordingly. So as a simple example, you can see how our address here is now a separate form group. We've also added a required to the first name. So the first name is required and the city of the address is required. With this, it's entirely possible for our address form group to be valid, but the form itself to be invalid. So this is kind of useful if you're making like a wizard, you know, one of your steps is complete and you can enable the next button for the next step. You can control a lot of the state and the validity and all that stuff at a granular level. And just a real quick one, again, Angular docs are really good. The abstract control is also a really powerful and clean interface in my opinion. So I recommend just giving the Angular docs a quick read if you're ever in this sort of section, you're ever doing something with forms, just to see what's available with you, with it. So why bother doing all this? So oftentimes you're kind of shaping your form to look like submission data for whatever API you're calling. But you can also treat your form as kind of pieces of state that can be validated separately, and then reshape that form once everything's fine into what your API payload looks like with like a mapping function. That way you can think of your form as slices of state in sort of Redux or NGRX kind of language, which is extremely powerful for, you know, wizards, large forms, complex forms. So an example here, again, following on from the last one, we're displaying a little banner once the address is valid. So the rest of the form may be completely invalid, but we can still feed back to the user that, yeah, the address part of this form is complete, we're happy with it. You know, you can move on to the next step, even if everything else in the form is completely invalid. It just gives us that granular control. So just a quick summary for this part. So we can split up our form into individual components on common groups of data. So we can split our user form into name, address, take it a little further, you know, add a group for education, we can add a form array of skills. And then all these individual components can be handled separately for their state. And we can also split those out into smaller components as well. As I always hammer on about, smaller components is more readable components, more maintainable components, less buggy, can be reused. Great stuff. We can use the control container to extract components without having to worry about managing form group preferences, wrapping children in form groups. And we're also able to inject the parent form into our components if we ever need to access it. This all means we can kind of compose our form in a way that lets us treat each part entirely separately. And obviously, if we're dealing with much smaller sections of state, it's much easier to work with. And from validation to the components themselves, each part becomes a reusable small part of a greater whole. And again, smaller parts, more readable, blah, 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 blah. Yeah, sweet. So let's move on to the validation section. You've probably used all the validation stuff before that comes out of the box with Angular, required, min length. What about kind of custom scenarios? So there's probably a few that seem familiar to you. So an example is a field is only required if another field has a value. So if a checkbox is ticked, then a field becomes required, otherwise it's not. One field must be greater than another field value. Another field must match another field. So, like password confirmation, email confirmation, that sort of stuff. We've done this before in a lot of our apps. I kind of wanted to bring in a few of my old snippets that I wrote myself over the past few years for some of these common functionalities. I went back recently and saw these snippets, and they're the reason I wanted to do this talk, because they're nasty. So I'm going to name and shame myself right here. So no, don't do this. Don't do that. Good Lord. Yeah, don't do any of that. That's bad.
Well, slow down, and can we pick over that, Tom? Come on, come back.
No, you may not. It's basically just a boatload of value changes and update value and validity and set validators and all that crap. Ugh, it's not nice. So the point of that wasn't to kind of chew myself out or chew anyone else out, really. It's more, if you find yourself writing set validators or update value and validity a bunch, 9 times out of 10, you probably could be writing a custom validator. The previous code that I showed all works. It's in live. There's no problems, which is great, obviously, but the disadvantages of that code should kind of be self-evident. It's huge, it's clunky, it's very manual. We're setting validators, clearing validators, forcing updates, forcing revalidations, and managing subscriptions for the changes. And we're doing this on several controls at once. I think some of those we're doing it on like 7 or 8 controls at once. It's really hard to read, it's really hard to maintain, and you're just asking for bugs. So this is basically what a custom validator looks like here at the bottom. They must contain a validator. I've just realized how confusing that name is now. Basically all it's doing is it's saying this control must contain the letter A. So A is very core, it's just a function. It takes in an abstract control and it returns a validation errors object. And all that means is it's literally any odd object. As you can see there, I've got must contain A and set the value to true. You can set that key to whatever you want. Yeah, but the key name itself is kind of important because it's what you'll use to identify that form validation error whenever it's set. To pass this into the actual control itself, you can see here, we just passed it in to the validators array. It's just a reference to the function itself. You could do it in line if you want, do your open bracket, close bracket, arrow, blah, 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 blah. It's really not fancy at all. Okay, so we should always be trying to sort of feedback validation errors as soon as possible to the user. It just makes it sort of quicker and easier for the user to identify what's wrong with the form. And they can fix it as soon as possible. It's just a nicer user experience. So all we need to do is check for the existence of the key that we gave our validator, which is that must contain A. If it exists, we know that our validator has failed. So we can see here, if I bring my drawing back up, we can see here, we can check for our must contain A key on the errors object. And if it exists, we can feedback to the user instantly this control must contain the letter A. So if you've got multiple small validators all on one control, if we're checking our error object, we can have a crystal clear idea of what's wrong with our form just based on which keys are present in the error object. Clear that. Move on. So for the validators operate on abstract controls. And abstract controls can be form arrays, they can be controls, they can be groups. They all follow that same strict interface. So due to this, we can design our validators with a control type in mind. So what this means is you'll be designing a validator specifically for a single control. You'll be designing a validator for a form group, or you'll be designing a validator for a form array. It's pretty rare that you'll be designing a validator that kind of operates on all three. You kind of know beforehand what you're writing it for. So we saw before an example of a form control validator. So we can take a look at a form group validator. So this is a validator that deals with multiple controls. Let me bring my drawing up again. Let's share it here. So we've basically written a validator that's checking that a password and confirm password value matches. And if not, it can feed back to the user that their passwords don't match. So the first thing we need to do is we pass it in at the form group level. So you can see here, it's not actually being passed into a specific control. It's being passed into the form group being generated by the form builder. And we do that by passing it into the validators property of the options. Yeah, so we could do the same sort of thing with a form array. So if you think about this control here, you would be writing it like, all right, I know this control is a form array. So I can do control.length greater than 2, and you're basically writing a validator there that says you must have at least 3 or more items in this form array. So by writing small validators that exist at like kind of every level, so your controls, your groups, what have you, we can build a fine-tuned set of validation, giving us a clear image of what's wrong with the form without manually having to hook into these value changes and fiddling with the adding and removing validators. And again, small validators can be reused across your app. Clear that. So following on from that, if you're going to be reusing your validators, you can add some options to it just to make it a bit more flexible. So we can use closures. So what this is doing is, you'll remember one of the common scenarios, I'm sure you've all dealt with this before, is where you're saying this field is required if this field has a value. So if this checkbox is checked, then I want this field to be required, otherwise it's not. So we can use a custom validator for this, and we can make it generic by passing in arguments. So we've created a little custom validator called required if. We can pass in 2 field names. So that way we're not tying it to a particular form. We don't know what the field names are going to be. This is basically just a factory function that's going to generate our validator for us. And then kind of generic code, what you'd expect, you're just getting 1 value, 2 values. If one of them's set, the other one's not set, then you've got an error. So we'll return this object. And then when it comes to actually registering this with our form group, instead of just passing the function in, we call the factory function, give it the 2 form control names that we want to use, and it will just work like magic. So that means really should be in a lot of our apps, because I know we use required if kind of everywhere. Cool. So validators can also be async. As we start moving towards like, observable state, or if you want to do, for example, an API call to check if a postcode's valid, we can do that with an asynchronous validator. So here we can kind of see a dummy validator down here, which we're using, we're returning an observable of validation errors rather than just validation errors. And all it's doing is it's mimicking an API call with an of, and then just returning that observable. From then, it basically acts exactly like a regular validator. You can kind of treat it as such. The only difference is I've used the form builder syntax here. You can see our second argument here is an array of validators. The async validators go in the argument along. So if you're using form builder syntax, it's an array. The first value is your default value. The second value is an array of validators. And the third value is an array of async validators. And that's pretty much it. It's not very complex. Obviously, Angular's kind of observable friendly. So it's kind of been adapted to allow you to easily use observables for validators as well. Sweet, that should pretty much be it. So just to wrap up, if you can break up your forms into smaller sections, I think it's very beneficial to do so. This is obvious for things like wizards, where each step will be its own component. But grouping parts of your survey by relevant data that can be reused in other areas, or splitting out parts that have some heavy logic or styling can keep your components small, testable, reusable, bug-free. We can use control container to pass the responsibility of handling form groups to parent controls. And we can just work in the child components with the assumption that form will be in scope when we're writing our components. So we can keep those children components quite simple, because those components no longer have the responsibility of wrapping a form group, passing it in from an input, all that stuff. It's also worth noting that this also works with different different roots. So if you've got router output, I think? So if you've got a router output that's displaying part of a form, you can use the control container directive to find your parent form group as well, even if it's in a completely different sort of root, as long as it's sort of wrapped in that parent form group. Writing custom validations is really easy to do. It's easy to write common logic, such as greater than, required if, etc., and share it across our apps. Or you can write more bespoke validators specific to an individual form if you've got some complex validation logic going on in there. Either way, there's really no need to turn off validators manually, turn them on manually. So you're reducing work, you're reducing bugs. Small validators help provide insight to what exactly is wrong with the form, and that can be fed back to the user instantly. So kind of combining all this together, it means your forms are super easy to compose, they're easy to validate, they're highly shareable, and you can provide immediate feedback to the user just to provide a much nicer user experience. And that's it. So hopefully that wasn't too basics, and you've picked up something new. I just kind of wanted to cover some of the basics of forms and validators that I find really useful in the day-to-day use of them. And I felt compelled to write that after I saw that BTL code that I wrote a couple of years ago. So this is kind of my penance, writing this talk. Yeah, that's pretty much it. Any questions? Fire away.
Can you pass the async validators in at the form level?
Yeah, they work exactly the same as every other form validator. You can pass them.
Take an object with the validators property, or is there like an async validators property? Or
no, it all goes onto the same errors property.
On the errors, sorry. I think when you add validators in a property level, you pass in an array. When you add them at a form level, you pass in an object.
Yeah.
So do you just put them in the validators object, or is there a separate property?
Right. Yeah, I see your point. Yeah, there is an async validators object, if I remember rightly. I won't put money on it, but I'm pretty sure there is an async validators property that you'd put that in.
Okay. Thanks.
Cool. Any other questions?
Is there any way to limit how often an async validator gets called? Does it happen on every key press or every change, or is it lost focus?
I kind of kept that out of it just to keep it simple. But yeah, if you're firing up an API call on that async validator, it will hit every key press and you will be spamming requests. So you do have to do some kind of trickery to put a debounce in there, or whatever solution you want to use. It can get obnoxious, but yeah, I just try to keep it simple here.
Would you just use a factory function to return the validator, and that basically does the debounce stuff inside of it, I think, wouldn't you?
Well, the factory function would create a new observable every time, so you couldn't debounce it because it's not going through the same pipe. You'd have to have some sort of shared validator that's kind of in a service somewhere that every time you hit a key press, it's kind of doing it's kind of emitting to like a state somewhere, and that's going to then pipe through your API call. It's going to put the debounce in, and it's going to somehow feed that back to the.
I don't know if this would be a bit hacky, but would you not? The factory function would create the observable, but the actual execution would always return the same observable. That might do something bad.
Yeah, off the top of my head, I'm not sure if that would work. Yeah, I'm not sure. Pass on that one.
I'll play with it.
I'm bailing out of that one. Cool. You're good?
Cool. Thanks, Tom.
All right. Thank you.
Cheers.
Cheers.
Cheers.